Hello everyone! In this video, we're going to cover a lot of advanced JavaScript concepts, some of which are API data fetching, asynchronous code, callback functions, promises, and async await. Most tutorials simply cover the way to fetch something from an asynchronous source. This video is going to teach you how you can first simulate or create that asynchronous source, and then how we can properly deal with the data coming out of it. Let's immediately dive into a real example of asynchronous JavaScript, and that is data fetching. With JavaScript, we can fetch data from a range of different APIs. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it is simply something that you can access the data from. Once we fetch the data, depending on the size of the data we are fetching and our internet speed, the fetching is going to take a certain amount of time. Opposed to the set timeout, where we always waited for 2 seconds, with real data fetching, we cannot be sure how long is it going to take. Now, let's simulate that data fetching. Let's say that we are trying to fetch a user from the database. This is the problem. Let's create that function, const fetch user, and that is going to be a normal function, arrow function, which accepts one parameter, and that parameter is going to be username. So, to fetch the user from the database, of course, we have to have his username. In this case, we are not simply going to return that user. So let's say user is equal to username. We are not simply going to return it. Why? Because this would be synchronous code. We want to make this asynchronous. We need to make this function wait some time to actually get the data. To do that, we can use the set timeout. So in here, I'm going to create a set timeout function. And if you remember, set timeout executes something after a certain period of time. So in here, it accepts 2 parameters. The first one is the callback function. And then the second one is the number of milliseconds when it is going to happen. So after 2 seconds. So what we want to do is expand this code block, and now inside of that, we actually want to return that thing. So in this case, we are saying, may our user be fetched after 2000 milliseconds. Now, let's create a new variable and retrieve that user. Const user, and that's going to be equal to fetch user. And let's say that we want to fetch the user with the username of Michael. Let's try console logging the user. As you can see, we get undefined. That means that the user couldn't be fetched. Now, just for this to make more sense, let's change this from user to username, because in here we are inside of an object, and the only thing this object has is going to be the username. We could add some other things like age or something else, but now let's just have the username, which is equal to username. And if you know in objects, if you just have the same key and value, you can simply keep the key and it's immediately going to take the value. What we currently have is we have an object that has the username, which is equal to Michael, because we are sending that over right in here and then setting in here. So that's what we are expecting, but we are not getting that. We're getting undefined. So let's try doing something more meaningful. I'm going to put a template string here, and I'm going to say your name is, and then in here, a template string, user.username. So we're trying to get the username from this object. If we do that, we get cannot read property username of undefined, which means that user is indeed undefined. Why is that the case? The reason for this error and the reason why the user is undefined is that the data wasn't returned from the function immediately. It waited 2 seconds. All of this works perfectly, but we get the data after 2 seconds. And since JavaScript is by default synchronous, it just executes this in a millisecond. So how can we make JavaScript wait 2 seconds and then console log this data when it is fetched after 2 seconds? Here comes the concept of callback functions. We can pass in a callback function that's going to run when the data is fetched. To do that, we can modify our fetch user function. It is going to accept the same thing again, username, but this time we're going to add the second parameter. And the second parameter is going to be called callback. That is the callback function. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to still call the set timeout. In here, we can even do a console log, and let's say console log. Now we have the user. So after the set timeout is executed, then we have the user. And in here, what we're going to do is instead of returning the user, we are going to call the callback function, this one here, and then pass the user in here as an argument. So in here, we are calling our callback function and then passing the data as the parameter or an argument of this callback function. But you might be asking, okay, we created this extra parameter here, but we are not doing anything in here. Of course, if you have two parameters, you have to pass in two arguments. So in here, we're going to add a comma. And now what did we say? What is the data type of the callback? Well, you can see here that we are calling it. That means that it must be a function. So in here, I'm going to create an arrow function as the second parameter. And then as you can see in there, we are getting the actual object that contains the username. So in here, I know that this object represents the username. So in here, I'm going to do user. And then finally, what I can do in here is I can console log, well, basically that same thing we had below. So your name is user.username. Now let's see if that is going to work. If I save that, you can see we get nothing, but this time it waited 2 seconds. And then we get, now we have the user, your name is Michael. So what happened here is that we created a callback function right here, and we didn't return the data from the fetch user function. What we did is we called that callback function right here. Now it would be incorrect to store this in a new variable because the function is not storing anything. What we're doing is simply calling the fetch user function and then putting a console log right there. So if we do it one more time, in here, before the set timeout, I can add another console log saying fetching ... and then below, yeah, as you see it, fetching ... and after 2 seconds, now we have the user. We get the user, we pass it over as a callback in this callback function, and then this code here is being executed. I know that this is a bit harder to understand, a lot of moving between the function declaration and the function call. This is maybe the first time you're seeing the function as the actual argument to the function. So that's it. If I now delete these console logs, just so it's a bit easier to see and put it like this, let me try to highlight what's happening one more time. We have this function declaration. Function declaration is not being executed yet. It is only executed after we make a function call. So that's happening right here. We call the function and we pass in the Michael as the username. Then our function goes into here. It waits 2 seconds. And then after 2 seconds, it passes that object containing the username over to the callback function as a parameter. And now in here, we have our callback function, which is being executed after 2 seconds. Basically, we're calling another function from our function declaration, and that is called a callback function. Callback because it calls back after a certain action. It happens after something is done. In this case, after the user is fetched.